All right. Good to be gathered with everyone today. We have a very special treat. The Plumbs will share their faith journey with us. And as I was telling them earlier, this has been so wonderful to get reacquainted with people at this time when, we sort of are seeing each other and sort of not. And then hearing in depth of how God has been at work in one another's lives just renews and revivifies. I'll speak for myself, my own understanding of how God is at work in my own life. So we're looking forward to hearing your presentation this morning, sharing in your journey. And we welcome those participants who are with us online. And we will start with a word of prayer. Holy and gracious God, we praise you for a new day. We praise you for this Lord's Day, that we can gather in this way with those who are joining us online and with those here in Fellowship Hall. We know you are present wherever we find ourselves. Thank you for your presence. May your spirit animate Bob and Louise as they share in their journeys in the ways that you have brought them together and them here and them in connection with you. Open us to recognize you afresh today, we pray in Christ's name. Amen. All right. It's all yours.
All right.
Okay.
Yep.
I guess, first of all, we should say these slides that you're going to see were created by our daughter, Sarah, and she did a marvelous job. So we take credit for the content that we talk about today, but the slides are our daughter's brilliant creative work.
Just a little bit, Bob.
Okay.
Can people hear? Okay.
All right.
Yeah. Speak
All right.
up a little bit.
And we had a great time going through pictures to gather our journey together, both mine and Bob's, separately in the beginning and then together after our marriage. So
No, so we don't have microphones for in here. This is for the Zoom. It's on. People have moved here. So the only way that we amplify here is speak loud.
Be glad. Okay.
all right, let's speak up. All right, Bob and I think
That would work like that. Yeah, or move forward needs to be better. People are having a hard time.
Go for it.
Bob and I think of our faith journeys as the story of our lives. And we grew up in upstate New York, across the Hudson River from each other. Bob lived in Albany and I lived in Troy. We didn't know each other, but we find that our stories are similar because of our influence of our grandparents and because they played a major part in our young lives. Their influence remains strong today. And I love this little saying, what good fortune it is to grow up in a home where there are grandparents. I'm an only child. I was born in the early wave of the baby boomers after World War II. My mother and father knew each other from grade school, but they didn't marry until my father was home on leave in the Navy in 1944. They were both in their early 30s by then. My mother had a career teaching home ec in the local junior high school and was living at home with her parents. So when my father came home, it just was expected that he would, that would be home for him as well. My house.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
this,
Just say
this
next slide.
this is my house in Troy on a busy street, Fifth Avenue, 765 Fifth Avenue. But it was a wonderful place to grow up because we had an empty lot next door to us, which we always referred to as the lot, but it became my playground and it was filled with trees and we gathered together as neighborhood kids. As it was often in the days for school teachers, my mother lost her job when she became pregnant for me. She was allowed to finish out the school year in June, but she couldn't go back in September. So they said that she probably would be out a lot with a young child to take care of. And my mother stood her ground and said, well, but we live with my parents and my mother will be taking care of the baby. But that didn't fly. So I was born in September and my mother and grandmother both took care of me at that year. My mother secured a teaching position for the next year in a school district 25 miles away from home. She was teaching high school home ec. As I turned 1, she started her new job. That began a bond with my grandmother that shaped the rest of my life. Nana and I spent a lot of time together and she was my best friend. I was the last of the grandchildren to come along, so I referred to her as Nana because that was what all the other cousins called her. And my grandfather was always Dad. So you'll hear me talk about Nana and Dad. It's not my father, Dad, it's my grandfather. My favorite place to be was on my grandmother's lap when she sang hymns to me at nap time. She had a deep alto voice and I can still hear that in my memory. My favorite hymn was In the Garden, and it still is. I learned about Jesus from the Bible stories that Nana taught me. That Jesus loves me and died for me was instilled in me by her love for me and for her love of her Lord and Savior. I felt that the Lord's presence in my life as a result of her nurturing and have never doubted his presence and the way that God has worked in my life. One treasure that she gave me, and I'll hold this up and you can look at it later, is a little mustard seed necklace. It's encased, the mustard seed, little teeny tiny mustard seed is encased in glass. And as she explained the parable of the mustard seed to me, that if I have the faith the size of a mustard seed, then nothing will be impossible for me. That comes from Matthew 17, verse 20. We lived in the city, and when I started kindergarten, my father and Nana would walk me across the street to the elementary school. It was just kitty corner. I lived at 5th Avenue and the school faced 4th Avenue. It was across the side street. So my grandmother and father would walk me to school, to Whipple School. And if you notice above me there, it says girls. The school was built in 1865. And on the opposite side of the school from where I'm standing was the boys' entrance.
Very politically incorrect.
The school had been attended by my mother, my father, my father's father, and my great grandmother. So it had a long history for us. And since there was no cafeteria, I would come home for lunch every day. All the kids did. We walked home. So I would have lunch with Nana and Dad, and we would listen to Paul Harvey on the radio. And I remember being sponsored by Carter's Little Liver Pills. I thought always fascinated me about little liver pills. I didn't know what they were, but next slide. My father's mother died when he was only 2.5, and his father died when he was in high school. So my father was raised by his grandmother. He referred to her as Grammy, and hence I took that name when our grandson Jack came along. My father was a quiet man who liked jokes, and he was a tease. When he had a twinkle in his eye, you knew he was about to tell a story. He was kind and gentle. He worked nights and slept during the day when I was at school. Next slide. My grandmother and grandfather were devout church goers. My grandfather's family of 7 children came from Scotland and settled in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He grew up as a Presbyterian and was later an elder and a Mason. My grandmother grew up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania with her 3 sisters as Methodists. Nana and Dad who were married in 1903 on December 17th, the same day as the Wright brothers flew their first plane, settled in Troy when my mother and her two brothers were young, somewhere around probably 1919. They joined the Second Presbyterian Church. And both of my grandparents were very active in activities there at the church and served on a number of boards. And Nana was very involved with women's groups at the church. Next slide. I attended Sunday school from the time I was on the nursery roll. This is Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church. My doll and I went to church meetings and events with Nana during the day, and I sat with her during the church service while my mother sang in the choir. I had just turned 11 when my grandmother died after having a stroke, and I had lost my best friend. Her loss was very hard on my mother because they had a very strong bond and had always been together. My grandfather died the following year from complications from Parkinson's, and a new chapter then started in our lives. My grandfather was a civil engineer, and the last time I saw him in the hospital, I was only 11, and my mother had to sneak me in because you couldn't go into the hospital until you were 16. So she snuck me in because they knew he was dying. So the last time I saw him, he told me to always stay on the plumb line. I asked my mother what my grandfather meant by that phrase, and she said, well, he means that you stay on the straight and narrow. I didn't understand what a plumb line, but it was to determine the true straight line. And I was to stay on the straight and narrow path. Second Presbyterian Church merged with Ninth Presbyterian Church, and that changed the name to Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, which is pictured here. It was a beautiful church with very old building that had the most beautiful stained glass windows. I was baptized in the church and grew up attending Sunday school, church, confirmation, and youth fellowship all the way through college, my first 2 years of college when I lived at home. This is a picture from my Bible that I was given when I joined the church after confirmation. Bob and I were married there in the church in 1969, and Sarah was baptized there in 1974. And in 2006, when my mother passed away, we held her service there as well. And she had been attending the church for 87 years. Next. During the summers of my college years, I worked at Silver Bay, a YMCA Christian conference center on Lake George in the Adirondacks. I had attended conferences there as a teenager, and I was a delegate from our church to attend. As the brochure that I came across just recently said, it offered, quote, Christian training, inspiration, and recreation for leaders and members of YMCA churches and related groups. Ever since I went there as a kid, I wanted to work there, and you had to have 1 year of college before you could join. And we were called EMPs, short for employees. We were all college students, and it was, we had the full use of the grounds and all the amenities that the guests paid for, as long as we were finished with our responsibilities. I was a housekeeper, and I was usually finished by 3 in the afternoon. So I got to enjoy swimming in the lake and playing volleyball, hiking, and I have a certificate that I climbed Black Mountain, which was a very high mountain. It was an all-day hike up and back. And the other thing that I accomplished was that I swam across the lake, and there were a bunch of us, and each one of us had a boat with us. And when I got out halfway out in the lake, I realized how wide 1.5 miles across is. We were, one of the church services on Sunday, we were required to go to, and we had to dress up. And one of my favorite events was the Vesper service on Tuesday evenings. And as I said, we were all college students, so they had hired two brothers and another one from Oberlin. So they were our Vespers evenings, and they played the violin and cello, and it was absolutely wonderful. I loved it. We were paid a small wage for our summer, but room and board was free, and I made great friends. It was all the fun of college without studying. It was great. Ever since I was in, next slide. Ever since I was in kindergarten at Whipple School, I knew I wanted to be a kindergarten teacher. And I stayed on that path through college at the State University of New York at Oneonta, where I majored in elementary education. Neither my roommate nor I wanted to go back to our hometowns to teach. So we both applied to Liverpool, New York school system. And luckily enough, we were both hired. And before we graduated, Liverpool is right outside of Syracuse, New York. We were hired, and before we graduated, we drove to Liverpool and found wonderful brand new apartment buildings. So we were all set to begin the next chapter in our lives. And I had no idea what was in store in that chapter.
Uh-oh, I think that's my cue. My birth date predates Louise. I won't tell you by how much, but I was born in Albany, New York. And by the time I was about 18 months old, my father had been drafted. It came like a cataclysm to the family. He was sent to Texas to train as an aircraft specialist and came home briefly. And that's the picture of his brief leave that he had to see me and my mother. And then he was sent to the South Pacific. He went to an island near New Guinea to be an aircraft specialist. They were guarding an air strip that was built on the island. If you recall your World War II history, MacArthur wanted to take the islands and get closer to Japan. So he was on one of those islands and guarding the airstrip. So consequently, my mother and I went to live with my maternal grandparents. And they are shown here. My grandfather standing on the right there, my mother to the left, and that's my great-grandmother sitting in the chair with me on her lap. She was an old-time Vermont woman who lived on a farm, an apple farm in Vermont, but she would occasionally come to visit us. My grandmother, where's my grandmother? My grandmother always liked being behind the camera instead of in front of the camera. So she took this picture. It was a very happy time spent with them. And one of the things that defined my position here, one of the things I did was go to church in Albany at the Albany Methodist Church with, whoops, let's back up a little bit. I got ahead of myself. My mother took me under her wing in terms of teaching me religion. And she had a book called Tell Me About God, which I have today. You can see it's very well worn if you want to come up and look at it. I think she especially liked it. Here it is, dedicated to me, because the main character is Bobby. So I think my mother probably read this book to me over 100 times. I know my grandfather did, my grandmother did, and I had two maiden aunts who lived with my grandparents. They were in their teenage years. So they also read the book, Tell Me About God. So I had some good experience early on in my life. My paternal grandparents, shown here, lived in Albany also. My grandfather on the right, on the left, obviously, was the director of pure food and drug for the state of New York in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So I would accompany them to church, and with my grandmother, who was very active in the Trinity Methodist Church of Albany. You can see my grandmother is somewhat formal. She insisted on being called Mrs. Plumb by her daughters-in-law. She had 4 sons, whom she always referred to by their full names. It was Lawrence, it was Richard, it was Carlton, my father, and Harry Franklin. They never had nicknames. And always her daughters-in-law called her, to her dying days, Mrs. Plumb. So while they were going to church at Trinity Methodist Church, I was in a classroom of other small children, taught by Mrs. Hageman. And one of the things that intrigued me about this is that on the wall in the back of the classroom was this painting of Christ. It's referred to as Christ at Heart's Door by Warner Salmon. I didn't know the name of the artist, but I saw this as a young kid, but I was intrigued by it. And one of the days in class, Mrs. Hageman said, let's talk about this painting that you've all been seeing. And she said, do you notice anything that's unusual about it? Well, of course, as kids, oh, well, the white robe. And no. She said, look at the door. There's no door handle. How can that be? How does the door open? You have to open it from the inside. And I think that metaphor has stuck with me for many, many years. When Christ knocks at the door, you have to open it from the inside. And some examples I'll cite this morning are examples of just that thing. My father returned from the South Pacific in fine health and condition. So we settled in a house in Albany, and we began our life post-World War II. And then my father was promoted to a new job within General Mills, where he had worked before the war, to take over an area that was General Mills would introduce new products in Syracuse. And so all of the new products that the company tested were tested in Syracuse. So that's what he did for a number of years. While there, we belonged to the United Church of Fayetteville, shown here. Two interesting aspects of it, at least interesting to me. One was the unification, the United, came from the fact it was a Presbyterian church and a Baptist church, which in my book is a little bit unusual. In the sanctuary up close to the pulpit was a tank that was covered over when not in use for immersion. And when I was a child, I saw one immersion baptism there, but somewhat unusual. The other unusual thing is that back in the 1850s and into the 1860s, Grover Cleveland's father was the minister here. So we joined the United Church. At this point, there were four of us: my mother, my father, me, and my baby sister, 6 years younger than I. And we had a wonderful experience there in the church. Here is my church membership, signed by the minister who was there when I was there. His name was Ivor Roberts. He was taught at Union Theological Seminary in New York and went from there to get his PhD at Edinburgh University in Scotland. So his sermons were very much kind of classroom of theology for those of us who hadn't been to theological school. A very interesting man. The other aspect about him that I liked is he was the first person, adult, who ever called me Robert, not Bobby, and I really appreciated that. One day after youth, we had a youth meeting every Sunday evening, and he was the head of that. And he, before the meeting started, he said, "Would you stop in my office after the meeting is over?" And of course, I was terrified. What had I done? I was thinking, well, what am I going to tell my mother? What am I going to tell my father? So I went to his office, maybe a little bit trembling at the time, sat down, and he said, "Robert, you know we have a Christmas pageant coming up." And I said, "Yes, Dr. Roberts." He said, "I'd like you to be Joseph." Sigh of relief. But then he said, "I have asked the Swedish exchange student in high school to be Mary, and she's agreed." Well, here I was, an 8th grade student, walking down the aisle with a junior from high school who was this beautiful Swedish woman. I was probably a bit infatuated. She tolerated me. That's about that, as far as it went. After high school, I went to the University of Buffalo. Here I am, sort of stuck as a freshman in the middle of the campus, wondering where I was going to wind up. It was an interesting time. I took the liberal arts program. I took biology, chemistry, philosophy, history, a number of different fascinating courses that challenged me. One in particular, since we're talking about faith, was When I was a sophomore, there was a course offered in the English department called The Old Testament as Literature. So I signed up for it. And the teacher was a professor fresh out of undergraduate at Princeton and Columbia University, graduate degrees, named Calvin Rand. Well, Calvin Rand gave an excellent course. And I went up to him several weeks into the program and I said, Professor Rand, I am really intrigued. I've been reading the Bible since I was a little kid, but you have introduced a whole new aspect. The Bible is literature. And he said, what church did you go to? I said, well, I went to Presbyterian church. He said, well, I'm a Presbyterian too, and you may notice some inflections of Presbyterianism coming across when I talk about it. At the end of my time there was a decision that had to be made, that the draft back in those days was breathing down everybody's neck. And I made the decision, I'm going to go to Navy officer school in Newport, Rhode Island, if they'll take me. So I took the physical test, passed it, took the mental test, whatever they called it in those days, and passed that. So off I was attending Navy officer candidate school in Newport, Rhode Island, as a very young, untested young man. There's a line from the Anchors Aweigh that goes something like, farewell to college joys, we sail at break of day. Well, that was it. There, farewell to college joys. It was a very challenging series of training that we took, everything from water safety and survival, sea survival in the water, to celestial navigation. And any of you who are sailors know that celestial navigation is not exactly something that comes easy to most people, and it didn't for me. I got my commission at Newport and was assigned to a ship, and the ship let Newport know that they wanted me to stay another 2 months and take a course at the Navy Justice School, so that when I came on board, I could be the legal officer, which was a collateral duty. In other words, that wouldn't be your main job on the ship. That would be a collateral duty. So I took 2 extra months of that and reported to the ship as Ensign Plumb. I wasn't on board more than a day, or I think it was 2 days, and I got called to the captain's cabin, and he said, I'm going to give you your assignment now, Mr. Plumb. You're going to be the communications officer on the ship. That is, you'll be responsible for all radio and radar. You'll be responsible for all the classified information, the combat information center, and also you will be, of course, the legal officer as a collateral duty. Well, that sounds like a pretty big plate. So I started to get up, and he said, wait a minute, Mr. Plumb, what religion are you? I thought, where is this going? And I said, well, Captain, I'm Presbyterian, I'm a Protestant. Oh, good. He said, you're the new Protestant lay leader. So I got up a little stunned, maybe another knock on the door. And I walked down the passageway and I ran into an officer who had come on board about the same time I did, Ensign Pellinger. I said, Hank, did you get your assignments yet? He said, yeah. I said, what are you going to do? He said, well, I'm going to be the assistant engineering officer on board. And he paused and he said, and I'm the Catholic lay leader. So I was a little stunned by all this, but I went down, this a couple of days later, I went down to the ship's office, and the enlisted men in the Navy who work in the ship's office are called yeomen. And there was a petty officer named Williams. And he said to me, Mr. Plumb, I understand you're going to be our new Protestant lay leader. I said, yeah, that's right. He said, you know, we have an organ on board that's down in one of the holes. And I said, well, Williams, that's great, but I don't play any musical instruments. He said, I do. Do you want me to play when we're out at sea and you do your services? Do you want me to play the organ? I said, absolutely. So he did. And in fact, we would even get, when we were out at sea, we didn't have a chaplain on board. I would run services and we would sing hymns and I would read passages of scripture. And we would have sailors who were not Protestants come in to join the hymn sing with Williams at the organ. My next tour of duty in the Navy was to be on a patrol boat. It's called a swift boat, about a 50-foot long boat. Our job was to patrol the coast and intercept any arms coming in. And it was going to be a year tour of duty. But it wasn't all military. One situation that developed when I was there was probably the mid-time when I was there. We got a call on the radio saying, would we go to a village along the Mekong Delta coast, which was my patrol area, and pick up a young Vietnamese woman who was expecting and was having some difficulties with that pregnancy, and that she would be accompanied by a parish priest. So we pulled into the area where the village was, and out came this very pregnant Vietnamese woman along with a Catholic priest. So we got them on board and started to move out down the coast. We were to take them up a river where there was going to be a Vietnamese hospital where we could drop them off. About midway there, I started hearing, I was up in the pilot house, the front of the boat, and I kept hearing this crying. So I walked back and said, Father, what's the problem? Is she in labor? He said, no, she's terrified of the ocean. As we were moving around, there were seas that were developed by the monsoon season, created 12 to 14 foot seas. So what you see here in this photograph is a very placid sea. We were bouncing around like a cork, and this poor woman was terrified. He said, what should we do? And I said, well, we're a few kilometers away from the river. The good news is once we get in the river, those heavy seas will stop. The bad news is there's an ebb tide coming out of the river, so we're going to be slowed down as we go up the river. And he said, what can I do? And I said, you know what you could do, Father? You could pray aloud with this woman. I don't care if it's in Vietnamese or French or English, but you should pray aloud. So I went back to the pilot house, and I could hear them praying back there. We eventually got up the river where we were supposed to meet two people who were going to take care of the woman from there. We got up there and docked, and the priest helped the Vietnamese woman get out of the boat and into the arms of these people who had an ambulance to take her to a hospital. The priest turned around and came back, and he said, I can't thank you enough for getting us here safely. He said, may God be with you. I said, well, Father, God was with us that whole time you were praying, going on this trip. So then my tour of duty in Vietnam was ended. I came back to the States, entered graduate school at Syracuse University. And even though I had completed my Navy active duty, I still had to appear 4 times a month, once a week, at the Navy Reserve Center to take part in their meetings. So here I was, starting up graduate school, starting up Navy Reserve training. And the Navy Reserve Center was in a place called Liverpool, New York. And so I went there and met this woman. We met one Friday night, and the next Saturday, that same Saturday, I called her and I said, you know, I have a paper to write. Actually, it's for a news writing course I'm taking, and it'll be a feature story. And what I thought I would do is go to the Syracuse, I think it was called the War Memorial. There's a winter sports show there. Would you like to go with me? She said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So off we went. I picked her up at her apartment. We went in, spent probably 2 hours collecting information that I needed to write my article. And as we were walking out, I said, you know, there's a brand new museum called the Everson Museum across the street. Interestingly enough, the architect that designed it is I.M. Pei, the famous American architect. He also designed the school where I'm taking classes now, the Newhouse School at Syracuse. Oh, she said, that sounds like a good idea. So we went across and we spent the rest of the afternoon wandering through the art gallery. And this picture was taken. I had a camera just to take pictures at the winter sports show. Here you see Louise with a bunch of brochures on skiing in her hand. That was taken our first date in Syracuse, New York.
And I'll point out the snow. This was, it was November, and we had a huge snow. So that's kind of how Syracuse is all winter long. So from November on into March or so. It's,
You're up,
am
right?
I next?
I think you're next.
I didn't know I was next. What's next? The wedding?
Yeah. What the timing of the wedding, yeah.
I was taking graduate courses at that point as well. And so Bob and I met, as I said, we said in November, and by April, we were engaged and planning a wedding for the summer. And it was easier to plan weddings in those days. And so we only had a little window of opportunity because we were both finishing. Bob was finishing up his graduate work and taking exams, and I was finishing up my courses that I was taking. So we had about 1 week that we could squeeze in a wedding. So I had gone home, I think it was around Easter time, and Bob was at the point having finished up his courses, and he was deciding where he was going to find a job. And he had looked at General Electric in Schenectady, New York, and then he also looked in Chicago at an ad agency. So I was telling my mother that, and she said, I think it would be a good idea if you let Bob work for a year and get established. And I said, we'll get established together. So we did. We were married in August 16th, 1969.
Yeah. I'd like to show this picture because you heard Louise talk about her grandfather telling her to stay on the plumb line. Well, if you look at this group in this picture, from left to right, at the left is my cousin, Richard Plumb, who is our best man. Next to him is my sister, Judy Plumb, who is the maid of honor, and Louise. Next to her, her future husband, Bob Plumb, and next to him, Jerry Plumb, who was a cousin of mine and was an usher. So Louise is literally on the plumb line here, surrounded by plums. And we were married at the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, as Louise
The
talked about.
one you saw before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's see. Catch up with our,
Babies there.
well, not yet. So the first job I took was with GE. I decided on GE, and I was in a training program in Schenectady, New York, where we had an apartment and then eventually bought a house. And then I was offered a job setting up an office in what is now Tyson's Corner that would handle the GE advertising in the middle Atlantic states. So we went to and lived in Reston, Virginia. And there, our daughter Sarah was born.
Sarah was born in September, and we lived in Reston for 5.5 years before moving to Miami. Our move to Reston, from Reston to Miami, was really difficult for me because Sarah had just turned 4 as we were moving. And I was leaving the support system I had of the young mothers that were in the neighborhood. We lived in a townhouse. We were surrounded by young mothers and children, and it was just a wonderful way to raise Sarah. And these women had become my family of playgroup moms, babysitters, nurses, confidants, friends. And now we were going even farther away to Miami and knew no one. We moved into
Maybe we should baptize Sarah.
Oh, I think we should have her baptized. Yeah, I forgot that. So when she was born in September, and this is December 1st, we drove up to Troy and had her baptized in the church where we were married and where I grew up. So that's my mother on the left, and Reverend Borthwick, the minister that married us, my father right behind me, the two of us, and Sarah and Bob's father behind him, his mother and his grandmother. And we had a wonderful time and took pictures of the 4 generations. It was really very, very special.
So the move to Miami was because I took a job with GE in the Latin American operations. We ran the entire continent of Latin America out of Coral Gables, Florida. So it was a very exciting job, but there were lots of opportunities beside the job there for us.
Yeah. We moved into our house in early December, And I soon realized we hadn't even looked at schools for Sarah. And so I got busy hastily looking to see if I could find a school that would take her in January. And the Lord led us right to the Kendall Christian School, which came under the umbrella of the Kendall Presbyterian Church, which is that picture. They had one opening for a 4-year-old in the class starting in January. So it all worked out beautifully. It was a wonderful faith-based school run under the umbrella of Kendall Presbyterian Church. So after a month or two, I was feeling a little more settled and got the boxes unpacked. Bob was doing a lot of traveling to Latin America. And I went in to put my name on the substitute list. And after a brief conversation with the director about my teaching experience, she asked if I was interested in a job teaching in a 4-year-old class for a teacher that was pregnant and who would be leaving at Easter time, and I could finish out the year for her. At that point, I said, yes, that would be wonderful. And I thought just, 6 weeks or so, that would be great. I was asked to meet with the school board for an interview. Well, I'd had lots of school board interviews, so I didn't think too much about it. And usually the questions were, how do you run a reading group? What is your approach to a parent-teacher conference? What's your theory on classroom discipline? So I felt pretty confident in that. So I sat down at a table, large table, and there was the director of the school, there were board members, and sitting right across from me was the head of the board. His name was Bill Christensen. And he started to talk, and I thought, okay, I was a little nervous, but he said, Mrs. Plumb, tell us a little about your Christian testimony. Well, that was not the question I was expecting. So I took a deep breath, gathered my thoughts together, and just shared the story that I've been sharing with you about the wonderful influence my grandmother was in my life and in teaching me about Jesus, and that I accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior. Well, I think I got the answer right because I got the job. The school was a little oasis in the middle of South Miami, and Sarah and I loved our experience there, singing Christian songs, learning Bible verses, reading from God-centered textbooks, and going to chapel with the minister every Friday. The nurturing atmosphere was different from any school that I'd ever taught in before, and both Sarah and I grew in our faith. About that same time that I was joining the school, we joined Old Cutler Presbyterian Church. Upon being presented to the session, both Bob and I were asked to stand up individually and give our Christian testimony. So I was confident in my answer this time.
I said to Louise, you had a trial run on this. I'm hitting this cold, but it was a wonderful church.
We attended Old Cutler for the 3 years that we lived, 3.5 years that we lived in Miami. And we're very proud of our John 3:16 bumper sticker that when you memorize the Bible verse, you could get a bumper sticker for your car. And we were very proud of our bumper sticker. So the time from when we were married to this time in Miami, it's a span about 10 years or so. And there were many, many joys and disappointments along the way. And I just wanted to share 2 of those with you. The joy you saw was in Sarah being born and being healthy and baptized and growing up. When we lived in Schenectady, I was pregnant, and at about the 6th month, the placenta separated and the baby was born early. She lived for a day, was very tiny, and when I saw her, I didn't see her. She was born on a Saturday night, and I didn't see her till Sunday morning. And when I did, I knew that she wasn't going to survive. They weren't saving babies that size back in those days. And I immediately called Reverend Borthwick and I said to him, could he come baptize her? And he said, I'll be right over. And I don't know what time it was. It was maybe 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. So he came and he baptized her. And he called me from a phone right there in the hospital, and he apologized. He said, I don't have time. I baptized the baby, but he said, I don't have time to come up because I have to get back to church. It's, Sunday morning, I've got to go preach. So I was so pleased that he was able to do that. And in the room with me was a young woman who had a little boy, and she and her mom were there dressing him, and they were taking him home. And she wished me luck and I wished her luck, and our baby was still alive at that point. And so later that afternoon, she passed away. But I was home recovering later in the week and looking at the paper, and there was a little obituary of this baby that I had watched them take home. And they put in names and addresses in those days. And so I was able to look up her name in the telephone book. And I called her a few days later and offered my condolences to her and told her that our baby had died as well. And she asked me to come over. So we had a visit. She was only 18. And it was a wonderful visit. We spent a couple of hours together. But it also made me realize that I hadn't taken my baby home. I hadn't held her. And in a way, it gave me strength that somehow when you think the worst thing you're going through, it isn't at all. There are other people going through even worse. And it just really helped start the healing for me. And then in 1980, when we still lived in Miami, I was pregnant again. And this time I was about 8 months along, and the cord twisted and the baby was stillborn. The hardest part of that, besides the devastating loss for both Bob and me, was the loss for Sarah. She was 5 at that point and had wanted a baby sister so much. And we didn't have the words to explain to her. So we had the minister from Kendall Christian School, Kendall Presbyterian Church, who had become friends of ours. And he came over and talked to Sarah and said, we don't know the answer to things like this. We don't know the answers to these questions about why things happen and what happened to the baby. But he said, that's a question we'll have to put in our back pocket and take to heaven with us and ask Jesus when we get there. I don't know if that solved anything for Sarah, but it certainly helped me along the line to know what exactly to say. And it wasn't until we were about to move down here when Sarah was 15 and Bob was already working down here. And Sarah and I were sitting at the dinner table, and I don't know, somehow the topic of the baby came up. And she just looked at me straight in the eyes and she said, I was so angry at you for that. She had thought it was my fault. And the two of us just burst into tears. And it was the first time she was able to express that particular feeling that she had, that how angry she was at me. So joys and disappointments go hand in hand. And that was a real moment for me to realize how the Lord was working in our lives right then. So let's see.
So you're going to hand it off to me after. Well, in keeping with our moving, I took a job at GE corporate headquarters, and we moved to Ridgefield, Connecticut, which is in the southwestern corner of the state, lovely little town. And we joined the First Congregational Church in Ridgefield. Delightful experience. And while we were there, Louise will talk a little bit about conversations she had with Sarah and making the decisions about the church. But while we were there, one of the members of the church was a man by the name of Wendell Forbes, and he worked for Norman Vincent Peale. And I got it in my head, and Louise and I agreed, it would be a great idea. My mother was having her 65th birthday. Wouldn't it be great to get a book signed by Dr. Norman Vincent Peale? And she was running a Bible class, a prayer group in a church outside of Albany. Wouldn't that be a great gift? So I approached Wendell Forbes and I said, if we buy the book, can we give it to you? Sometime can you have Dr. Peale sign it? He said, we'll do better than that. Let's have Dr. Peale select the book and then he'll sign it. So sure enough, a couple of weeks later, Wendell Forbes came in with The Treasury of Joy and Enthusiasm by Norman Vincent Peale, and then the inside to my mother for her devotion to church and family. Well, of course, we gave this to my mother. It was like, oh my gosh, what gift could you give any better than that? So she took that to her prayer group meetings many, many times. And we have a copy of the book, and it's very well worn from being used with her prayer group.
Yeah. She has little markings in it and dog-eared pages. Well, we moved to Ridgefield during Easter week, just the week before Easter. And our inn that we were staying at was right across the street from the Congregational Church. And it was Easter Sunday, so we went right across the street and we started going there. We liked the minister and it was very friendly. They showed us around the church and told us a lot about it. So we continued to go until summertime. And we said to Sarah, well, we've enjoyed it, but maybe we'll look at some other churches. And she said, why? I like it here. So we thought, well, that's half the battle. So she grew up pretty much from age 7 to 15 in that church and was very, very active in youth fellowship and everything that the church did. And they had a camp, much like Silver Bay that I went to. It was called Silver Lake in Sharon, Connecticut, and it was a church camp as well. So she went there for a good number of years. And then later, after we had moved down here, she was asked to come back and be part of what was called Camp Family. And then she became a counselor. So it was a great experience. And she loved the Ridgefield Congregational Church. So we came here in 1990.
I was on the church council, which is kind of like the session in our church here. And towards the end of our time in Ridgefield, an opportunity came to move down here for another job with GE. And so I said to the church council group, I think there are about a dozen of us, Louise and I and Sarah are going to be moving pretty soon. And somebody said, where are you moving to? I said, well, we're not sure exactly where, but the office is in Rockville. And there was a woman who served on the committee with me, and she spoke up. Her name was Doris Yates, and she said, oh, you need to go to Potomac Presbyterian Church. So following her advice.
Yeah, and when we got here, there was a couple that had been at the Congregational Church, the Barthelmans, and I don't know if any of you remember Barb, and I forget his name, but Barbara Barthelman. Anyway, they were members here and had been members in our Congregational Church up there.
So we have two more.
So we have two more slides.
We have Sarah's wedding, our daughter's wedding.
Sarah and Lou were married here in 2003. And then in 2006, Jack was born and baptized. He was born Christmas Eve. And so this is 2007 in this picture, because it was May, I believe, when he was baptized. So that's Lou's mom and dad, Leo and Josephine DeJoya, Lou and Sarah, Bob, me, and Carrie Stoltzfus, and little Jack. So
Who's now 16.
he's now 16, he's 16. And as many of you know, Bob and I have held lots of positions here at the church and have enjoyed, well, we've been members, I think, 27 years. So we've enjoyed every bit of it and all the positions we've held.
We both have kind of summaries to conclude our talk. Mine comes from, thanks to Bob Stowe, who just walked out. He made me aware of this man by the name of Reverend Chandler Gilbert. He is a congregational minister in Massachusetts. And he said, and it just struck me, these words, "I have had a number of experiences where I could see God at work in my life, though more often than not, it was my interpretation of those events in retrospect that led me to that conclusion. Faith is trusting those experiences, remembering them, and allowing them to shape my understanding. I cannot force them to happen. All I can do is wait, trust, and keep the door open to receive them."
This is from, we refer to him as Bill Nye, but his full name was William Grant Nye, who was the pastor of the Congregational Church. And a wonderful, wonderful preacher, wonderful man, and unfortunately died way too early. And this is a quote from him. "One of the most remarkable things that can happen to anybody is to become part of a family of faith." And we love our family of faith here.
Do we have
Thank you.
time for questions?
Anybody have 2 minutes?
2 minutes. Okay. Have to ask them fast.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for giving your stories.
Thank you.
What are you going to do for an encore?
Go to church.
Bob, when you took celestial navigation in the Navy and
Uh-oh.
you were out there in the middle of the sea,
Yeah.
looking up at the sky, did that give you a kind of religious experience there?
Well, there are two experiences, Tom. I will tell you. One experience is having to learn celestial navigation and being sort of overwhelmed by its complexity. And the second is the beauty of the sky and the universe that you're part of. Yes, those two things came to mind frequently.
And then it was awfully lucky that you got, the opportunity to meet Louise there. And guess it was good that you went to that museum, huh?
Well, we have often said it was Providence that brought us together.
We fully believe that. He did. He told me to stay on the plumb line. He knew it when I was 11 years old.
Little trivia, who knows which book of the Bible the plumb line is from, that line? Who uses that? What prophet? You know? Amos. Amos talks about the plumb line. Yeah, it's biblical. Yeah.
Oh, look at
Well, maybe somebody can answer this question too. When I was maybe 8 or 9 years old, I used to go to Maine, and my grandmother, maternal grandmother's brother lived there with his wife, and he used to call me Nicodemus. Never could figure out what that was all about.
Pharisee. He was a wise Pharisee and one who at night went to see Jesus.
Well, maybe there was a message
Maybe it
there
was
for
that
me.
chaplaincy. I was intrigued by your being chaplain or your being the Protestant
Lay leader. Oh, yeah.
or your boat, your ship, the Navy.
The Navy ship,
So that just started
Well,
turning
that's-
things in
there's
my
a link.
mind about your.
There's another adult ed.
There we go. There we go.
Did you have a crow's nest that you used in the Navy then? My father was in First World War, and he talked a lot to me about that war. And he was always in a crow's nest, and he was practically with the waves. He was practically in the water when we turned around. I don't know. He went to Newport too, and he ended up as a lieutenant. they graduated as junior grade.
Yeah.
Daddy needed the money to go back to college. And so he went on a special trip and he got his lieutenant. So he loved it. And he just kept that in his heart all the time.
We need
The
to hear
Navy
Jude's
was his
story.
fun.
Tom, we'll wrap it up with your.
Sure, I grew up in Troy.
I know.
I never heard. Kittle, is that your maiden name? Yeah, I grew up in Troy, New York, and I never heard a bad word about the Kittle family. So rest assured.
There are two things. It's spelled exactly the same way, but one family pronounced it Kittle, and our family pronounced it Kitchell. And I was forever being called Kittle, and even in my high school yearbook, it says, "My name is Kitchell, not Kittle." Now you know. There was a dentist, Dr. Kittle, but it was spelled the same way ours was.
Well, many, many thanks, Bob and Louise, for that inspiring, beautiful, heartfelt story. We're the better for it. Our faith is strengthened by it. So we'll go into worship now to live into the light of God's love that you've planted for us to think about.
Thank you.